name is Tom Deans, and I want to talk to you today about the writing histories and attitudes of exemplary STEM majors. So if you want access to this slide deck, here's the place to go. You could pause and copy that out. Well, let me begin real briefly with just sort of the basics of method here for the study that this is based on. I spent time interviewing 16 STEM majors, all at the same research institution, all of them active researchers in labs, all of them heading for advanced study in STEM fields, and most importantly, all of them were nominees or winners of highly competitive fellowships, grants, or awards. Some of those were national fellowships like the Goldwater or the NSF, and some of them were internal to the university where they all were students. But all of them went through a faculty vetting process to be nominated, at least nominated or selected for these awards or programs. So in some sense, they outcompeted a lot of other really good, strong A students and came out as an even more select group of STEM majors. You can see the basic demographics here. They skew towards seniors, and you can look at the gender and the racial background as well. And so all of what I'm going to share with you is based on 32 interviews, 2 with each of these students. One of them focused on their literacy history, one focused on their current attitudes towards writing, their opinions about writing in college. And I also asked them to bring in a text that represented themselves as a writer so we could have a kind of process-based, document-based discussion of that particular text. So let's start with that first interview. I learned about their histories. Even after interviewing a few of these folks, and certainly after interviewing all of them, I learned that these aren't just strong science students. They were just strong students and intellectuals and strivers, period. You know, they had done that from the start of school. They loved school. School loved them back. They'd been involved in enrichment programs really from early on and continued on through their high school and college careers. But what they weren't is students who kind of stereotypically said, hey, I'm a math science person, and the heck with all this kind of softy, wasteful English, arts, and languages and things like that. These tended to be students who, yes, had a passion for the sciences that took them into these STEM majors and ultimately to these awards or fellowships. But they were also very much engaged with the arts, languages, social justice movements, activism, culture. Those are the kinds of students, by the way, who tend to get selected for these multidimensional students tend to get selected for those kinds of fellowships. Now, also thinking back early, all but 2 of these students, when I mined them for sort of what are your earliest memories of writing, very positive early memories of writing, sometimes downright celebratory and exuberant about, you know, writing poetry and stories and having those circulated in their houses and parents affirming them and getting public venues for their writing. Some of them even thought they would become writers. And most continued that trajectory of having pretty strong and positive experiences in English classes, although those classes were not quite as universally positive as their early experiences. Add that up and compare it to what we learned from Lisa Emerson and her research on the attitudes of scientists and science students to writing. There's a real contrast there. Emerson finds that the majority of her science students actually had pretty negative experiences with writing early in their schooling careers. Some of them had downright traumatic experiences with writing and only reconnected as writers later in their scientific careers and came to sort of see the mesh between those and the complementarity between those. This group never had that kind of negative reflex around writing born of bad experiences in school. They did, however, report being kind of tired of the literary analysis they do in English classes. That kind of writing was growing pretty stale for most of these students by the time they finished high school. They were still good at it. They still did AP English and so on, but they didn't want more of that in college. They did, however, almost to a person, really single out great teachers in history and English who gave them more freedom to write in high school, allowed them creativity and voice, and they still very much remember those teachers. So these are really well-rounded STEM students for the most part, who also maintain strong interests in culture, art, identity, ethics, activism, social justice work from high school and very much into college. And one index of that range of interest that they bring is the fact that majority of these students double majored. Now, sometimes they were double majoring within STEM, like mechanical engineering and statistics, but at least 6 of those 16 were double majoring or minoring with fields outside of STEM, like sociology or anthropology or philosophy or French or Spanish. And that's a little different than what we used to find. I think the double majoring has become more common in college, but especially among these high flyer students. And it cuts against some of the early assumptions of writing in the disciplines, where we have a theory built around acculturation into a particular discipline that kind of assumes one major. And when students start writing in multiple majors for multiple purposes, it starts to at least question that more singular approach to wit theory. Now, in the college years, I had these students kind of trace their development as best they could from first year to where they are now, and also even do things like inventories of all the writing they could remember from the classes they had taken in the most recent semester. And there's some interesting parts about how they inventoried that we could get in the question and answer. But the big payoff here is that they are writing a lot. At least this group was writing a lot throughout their college years. I'm not worried at all that they're not getting enough opportunities to write. But one thing I am worried about is that they reported getting very little feedback in their STEM courses by their STEM faculty. They just, even in the W or writing intensive course, most reported pretty minimal feedback and very little, especially rhetorically based feedback, right? Maybe a few little corrections here and there, but they really didn't feel like they were learning to write in those classes the way we would hope. That doesn't mean that they were not learning to write, especially this group. It's just that they were writing and learning in a different place. And where that was is in their labs. And I don't mean their lab courses, I mean the undergraduate research labs. So they testify to learning more about science writing in their research lab than in their courses. And that came through the sustained interaction with grad students, faculty PIs, peers, all of those gather in the lab. And they got kind of real-time feedback on writing that circulated in the lab. And they observed what was happening with the grad students and their faculty PIs, and were invited to participate, at least on the edges of that, sometimes a little more centrally. And so this was further confirmed when I asked them, well, do you use handbooks, or do you use websites, or do you go to the writing center? And most of them were like, no. But they did have rich relationships with these grad students, fellowship advisors, faculty PIs, and in the research labs. They also looked towards peers and faculty members. And one other key relationship that emerged for them, especially during the fellowship process, was with the fellowship advisor on campus. So if your campus is like mine and it wants to have students get involved in these large national fellowships, they have a key person who coaches students through that process. And we have that kind of person on our campus. And that person gave these students more feedback on their writing than just about anybody else. These students reported this to me, that especially during that fellowship process, they did more iterative work. They weren't used to coming back and drafting something 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times with the kind of feedback they got. And that was difficult for them. And indeed, the personal statements they had to write for the fellowships were more difficult, they reported, than the signature genres in their field, right? More difficult than their senior theses or senior engineering design reports, but also for them, ultimately more rewarding and more meaningful. I mentioned in the second interview, I asked them to bring things into my office, right? So what did they bring? I said, bring one piece. If you need to bring 2, you could bring 2, but try to limit it to 1. In fact, most of them did bring 2. What half of them did was, if you see on the sort of blue stripe there, they brought in 2 items. One of them in a scientific technical genre. It might have been a class paper, but more often than not, it was something like a proposal for the Goldwater or a university scholar proposal that was very research and technically oriented because it was keyed to the work that they were doing in their research lab. And they wanted to bring another, usually more narrative-based piece, like especially the personal statements for, say, their med school application or their fellowship applications. In some cases, this was a poem or a blog post that they had also done that was meaningful to them. That wasn't necessarily, in fact, wasn't at all what we would call technical writing. You know, there are actually 3 students who brought in work that was not at all what we might call scientific and technical. It was kind of adjacent to that. And that might have, for one, that was just the grad school personal statement, a straight up personal statement. For another, was a Truman policy proposal, which is a scholarship for public policy. But this molecular and cell biology major found that his most meaningful writing, rather than the senior thesis he was working on in molecular and cell biology. Another one brought in a public-facing blog post that I'll touch upon in a little while. A pattern that emerged related to what I was just talking about is that when students were doing something really different outside the orbit of the core kinds of disciplinary writing that they associated with their major and their labs, they often found that writing particularly meaningful. So a writing in the discipline orientation might predict that students will find their most meaningful writing to be their most sophisticated lab reports, senior theses, engineering reports. In some of these cases, these students were even involved in co-authors on journal articles. And that, we might say, that should be meaningful to these budding scientists. Because WID values incremental development within the discipline achieved through sustained practice with a set of valued genres, right? But that's not what we see these students reporting as their most meaningful writing. Instead, they testified that the writing that was really different and challenging for them was the most meaningful. These students clearly value mastery of disciplinary writing, but they persistently associate writing, when you use that word writing, with personal agency, identity building, and even life beyond their work in the lab or in their majors or in their future careers. This was most manifest in the personal statements for fellowships and grad schools, as I suggested, but it even came out in things like a computer science major who had a summer internship at a cybersecurity firm, doing pretty sort of high, intensive technical work. They asked him at one point, would you like to write something for our blog? And he took up the task and he wrote this piece that ended up being a fairly witty, narrative-based piece on a certain pioneering cybersecurity person. And it ultimately did get published. And this is what that student brought in as representing himself as really meaningful, rather than the senior thesis that he was working on, which was quite complex and impressive. So these academic high flyers persistently associated writing more with personal agency and public impact than with disciplinary participation. Now, this may be resonant for some of you with the Meaningful Writing Project, which, you know, Michelle Iadice and Ann Geller and Neil Lerner did several years ago. I love this project, and when I read about it, I was struck by this finding up in the right corner here that when students were asked, what's your most meaningful writing, 79% of them said it is something that they hadn't written anything like it before. So I was familiar with that, and that seems quite resonant with what these students were saying. But actually going into this study, I thought, well, with these students who are so accomplished and are so focused on their aspirations in the sciences and living that out through their lab research, they're going to likely pick something that's showcases that. Instead, they followed the pattern that the Meaningful Writing Project discovered in terms of the link between novelty and meaningfulness for these students. There's something similar going on with identity and meaning. So the personal statements may have played such a prominent role in our conversations, in part because they were recent for these students, and in part because they'd gone through so many drafts with the fellowship advisor. But they saw them as more than instrumental to winning fellowships or entry to a top med school. Many of them reported affirming, adjusting, synthesizing, questioning their identities through the writing process of these personal statements as they drafted and revised. And they deeply valued that iterative and epistemic process, at least in retrospect. They said they really struggled when they were doing it and often got frustrated, but this is afterwards where they see the most rewards for writing. And there's a couple of statements here that I don't have time to read aloud to you, but I would encourage you to take a look at them, where students are talking about how the personal statements are meaningful because they're describing who I am, or helping them define and refine their own aspirations, even though they have pretty clear ideas of where they want to go. These personal statements help them either affirm or refine them. So these students don't reject the novice to expert trajectory assumed by WID. In fact, they've lived it out. They've shown that they can do that. But these students don't see disciplinary expertise as the sole or even the primary purpose of writing for themselves. And I think this brings some provocations for writing studies, and especially for WID. And I, for one, have been invested in a vision of WID that's pretty traditional, that asks students to think about sort of entering a particular field. And I've worked with faculty, and I still work with faculty every day to help them design courses that help students enter their communities of practice and their research conventions. And I've co-edited a series of books that doubles down on the idea of very discipline-specific writing. But this study made me less confident in traditional WID assumptions, and that's because these students insisted on multiple priorities and purposes for their writing, because they insisted on bringing 2 items rather than just one into my office, and because of things like their insistence on double majoring or multiple minoring. And as I was doing this study, I was also reading this longitudinal study out of the University of Michigan by Ann Geer and her colleagues. And in a kind of happenstance, they were finding much the same thing. There's a couple of case studies of STEM writers in this book, and their analysis of the interviews with their students at Michigan could easily have mapped onto what my students were saying as well, in the sense that these students, yes, they are committed to mastering the disciplines that they need to for their scientific futures, but they're also really committed to other modes of writing, especially writing that is key to the personal, to the public, and to narrative. So these patterns that I'm describing may apply more widely than for these exemplary writers, although we certainly need to do more research to confirm or question them. So I want to say one final thing about what the implications of this might be for, specifically for English departments or writing programs. And again, I'm really talking about for these particular students who are high flyers. For them, more technical writing classes are not what they need or want, right? Because they are already learning that through the lab. Another thing they don't really need or want is literature courses with a science theme, especially if those courses are going to run them through the paces of close reading and the kind of literary analysis that they've done through most of their schooling. What they do want is more courses built around genres key to story, identity, ethics, art, activism, public health, how to bring together these various elements of themselves that are sometimes reflected in their multiple commitments and multiple majors. And the genres where this is most likely to happen are those somewhat close to those personal statements that they've already shown for them are quite rewarding and meaningful. So life writing, creative nonfiction, medical humanities, disability studies, environmental rhetorics, public writing. We're talking here about writing as a liberal and rhetorical art. And in some ways, this suggests a return to the kind of right to learn ethos of the early WAC movement. Again, this surprised me, but it's where the evidence led me. So finally, these emerging scientists, engineers, and doctors have aced school and immersed themselves in undergraduate research, and through that, they've learned technical and disciplinary writing. But they are still very much persons in process, discovering who they are, and they're intrigued by how writing can figure into that process. I think we should help them do that. Thank you. Now, I'll handle questions during the question and answer period. And if you want to learn more about this study, you can check it out in a forthcoming piece and across the disciplines. I'm not sure when exactly that will appear, but it will be out in good time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Scheuber, and I direct the Writing Across the Curriculum program at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. The research I'm going to share with you today has been ongoing for me since I started as WAC director in 2009. And that's when I noticed that when they're introduced to WAC, some faculty worry that giving more attention to writing in their courses will get in the way of their coverage of course content. And so I got really curious about what this meant, because I'd hear things like, if I spend a class on peer review, I'll have to cut half of the 19th century. What does this mean? So in 2013, I conducted a survey of about 121 faculty across the disciplines on their views regarding coverage, and I learned a lot. There was this complex web of discourse around how faculty approach this idea of coverage, and I wrote about it in a WAC journal article you can find fall of 2015. Then in 2016, I decided to go in depth. And so I completed 17-hour to an hour and a half long interviews with faculty who self-identified as successfully using writing as a means of achieving coverage, not as an obstacle. So I wanted to talk to the faculty who didn't see writing as an obstacle to coverage to see, well, how did they view this issue and how did they approach it, and maybe differently than others. So here is some information about the 17 faculty members that I interviewed. As you can see, they're from a range of disciplines and also a range of years of teaching experience. Here are some things I learned in general. Because most faculty and students have easy online access to much more information than in the past, these faculty that I interviewed realized that truly covering disciplinary content is impossible. You cannot cover. Some faculty use writing to cover traditional content knowledge, whereas others use it to cover skills such as critical thinking. And for some, this was a shift that happened over time. And it was really interesting to hear about that from the more experienced faculty members, about how their views of coverage changed. But that's a different paper. Moving on. They seem to realize that lecturing or assigning reading does not cover course content if the students do not retain the information. So I noticed a shift from a subject focus or a faculty focus to a student focus. As one faculty member said, it's not what you've taught, it's what they've learned. And many faculty say that narrowing their scope of coverage, focusing on more skills and using WAC practices, especially using writing as a tool for both learning and engagement, has led students to better coverage, to achieving better coverage. It's more memorable, more impactful, what they've learned. So I'm kind of mimicking Tom here in that I'm going to share with you what surprised me the most in my research. And it was something I wasn't looking for at all, just like him. So faculty mostly discussed how assigning student writing helped them to cover their official learning objectives for the course. However, I noticed as I went along that about half of them, unprompted by any of my questions, also chose to discuss how writing helped them to meet other goals they had for students. And here are some qualities of these goals. They were generally unaccessible. So they were not learning objectives that could easily be graded or even directly connected to the course content. They often focused on dispositions and attitudes, not on content or skill learning. Often they went beyond discipline-related goals to broader goals that they had for students' lives in the future. And they seemed aspirational, meaning goals that faculty hope students will achieve, but not necessarily right away. And so that sort of goes to the unaccessible part, right? So I hope that they are this way in the future, and we'll never know, right? So I tried to sort of slice and dice all this data, and I've developed a few categories of goals that I noticed. So one is that students develop dispositions leading to success in work and in life. And here's an example from a faculty member from business management, where she wanted students to learn how to take initiative. So on the rubric for her writing assignments, she had all the qualifications students needed to meet on the rubric up to a B. But for the A, there was not much direction, except that the students needed to go beyond the assignment parameters. And of course, as you can imagine, students would be rather frustrated with this, but she explained, it's training them for what will come next, which is you need to figure out how to push yourself and how to get yourself noticed, that you rise above, that you show you can do more. If you do X, Y, Z, you're a good employee, but how do you figure out what the other stuff is? Well, it wasn't specifically asked of you. It's kind of that initiative stuff. That's where I got my title. So this faculty member has a larger goal beyond her, business management learning objectives, where she wants her students to learn how to take initiative. A professor in German focused on persistence. And this is a course that, unlike the business course, was not for majors. All students at St. Thomas need to show language proficiency. So the German professor said this: learning a language is also applicable for other subject areas and for their future lives. They may not ever use German again, but what we teach them, memorizing concepts or words, trying to negotiate meaning, doing research, being exposed to a topic and having to deal with it in depth, doing stuff that is boring and hard, stuff that is hard. And they will see that over and over in their future careers. So I sometimes actually now start by saying, this is difficult, and I could just go the easy route and not cover it, but I would not do you any favors, because in the future, you will encounter difficult situations. And so then you already have maybe the tools to deal with that. It's almost like an emotional learning. And then my faculty member from social work was focusing on open-mindedness, not coming to premature conclusions that are not backed up with evidence, which is obviously a very academic skill, but she was extending it into students' lives as well. And the biggest thing that I think is really hard is being willing to let go of what you've always believed when the evidence suggests otherwise. And most of us have trouble with that. And one of the things I try to say is, we don't progress if we're not open to accepting the fact that sometimes what we believe we later learn is not true. And this faculty member believes this open-mindedness is necessary for being able to make a claim, not just in writing, and she has a big research project she has students do, but in your regular life. don't make a claim about something if you don't really know what you're talking about. And finally, for this category, a theology, which is a core requirement at St. Thomas. All students need to take theology. And this faculty member wanted her students to look at life, not just the theology, with a critical lens. She's teaching the biblical book of Lamentations and connecting it to American memorial sites, asking questions such as, what are the ethical values embedded in this monument? What does it say about gender? Who's not here? And the faculty member says, now when we go to a memorial or historical site, you're going to take different critical lenses with you when you look at it. I think they, the students, really appreciate it. I'm not covering, I am covering. I don't feel any guilt whatsoever. It's not just about a bunch of people back then, it's about us. And then she also follows up with a comment on her focus on gender and inclusion in these theology classes. I try to focus on the reality of what they're going to remember 10, 20 years from now. And it's not going to be, the historical survey. It's going to be the transformative moments where all of a sudden they see something in a different way. Another aspirational goal that faculty have for students is that they develop empathy for others, that they understand difference. One example is from history. This professor wants students to understand that not everyone thinks in the same ways as they do. And this was specifically connected to non-majors. The faculty member wanted for them to understand that things change over time and that it's important to understand that not everybody from every culture thinks the way we do today. That's incredibly important. And they're going to have great difficulty working across cultures if they can't do that. So this faculty member was imagining students with, all sorts of careers, not necessarily connected to history, where they would need to be working across cultures. They need this skill. And then back to the faculty member from business management, wanting students to realize that people are different from you. It seems so basic, doesn't it? And yet it's a big learning. I want them to know that people are different than you. That isn't good or bad. You need to use these differences. That actually brings you strength. You have to know who you are. So self-knowledge and realizing that others are different and how to kind of harness that in the workplace and in life. Another goal that faculty had that was more aspirational was for students to become change makers in the world. A professor of psychology was teaching a course in psychopathology, which is a more narrow course, but it was required of a lot of, several majors. And so some of the students were not too enthusiastic about it as a subject and wondered why they needed to take it. And she had a lot of content to cover as well. What she came to was this: I want them to care about it, the treatment of those with mental health issues. And I want them to care about it with their votes. And I want them to care about it on the street. And I want them to be part of a revolution of changing things for people living with mental health issues. I was hoping that they would internalize the information, that they would see its relevance in their daily life and the lives of others, and that they would have a personal connection to it and it would ignite a passion, that they would carry it with them as something that was important, and maybe even be advocates. Her attitude toward the students was, most of you are not going to be mental health professionals. And the lived experience for yourself, for your family, your coworkers, for the world, to me, is so much more important than the science. And so that was a big leap for this faculty member because she's all about the science and how it's constantly changing over time, what is truth. And in the end, she came to the lived experience of her students at some future time dealing with mental health issues, either themselves or people they know, like that. And then shifting to justice and peace studies. This was a course for majors. And so, I mean, the goal of the whole major is that students become change makers. So it's not really aspirational in the sense that it's not a typical learning objective of this major. And yet I include it because it just seems like such a huge goal and very future oriented. So I'm including it. We're not looking to create liberation theologians or activists necessarily, but we want to create liberation accountants and liberation engineers. And really, the central question we're asking students to wrestle with is, are you here to fit into the world as it is and succeed on its terms, or are you here to change the world? And if you don't make that choice, then really you've already decided for the first one. And this faculty member says, and that's where the assignments are always moving toward. It's always toward action. It's always toward what change can you make? Not just to understand, but to advocate or act. And finally, a goal that I saw was students developing self-knowledge about what gives them pleasure. So I'm moving from one extreme, activism, to this very personal goal about what do you like, figuring out what you like. And my very last interview was with an art history professor, and I had already turned off the tape. And I said to him, you know, a lot of the people I've interviewed have had these other sorts of goals. You know, they're sort of beyond the subject matter that they have for their students. And I named some of them. And he said, oh yeah, I have that. I want my students to be creative. And then he just, you know, referred to some of his writing assignments where he has them use their creativity. But I can't use that because I turned the tape off. But I do have this one from English, and it's a good one. Two contexts I'm going to share with you. The first one is with first-year students. So the anecdote is this. She asked students to share a book that they had read recently that just blew them away. Something that sucks you in and sort of pulls you out of reality, and you're blown away with it. And you emerge from it feeling like you're a different person, you know? That kind of book. But the result, she said, it was horrible. So she had 2 sections of 20 students, and only 2 students in each section, 4 students total, could even mention a book that had impacted them in that way. And those 4 students, it was all Harry Potter. So something they had read back when they were 11. She said, I was so depressed. I went back to my office and I just thought, I have to do something different. I want part of my goal to be that they can enjoy something in literature and that it's not just drudgery or the assignment or whatever. So now she explicitly lists finding something they love in the literature as a goal, though, as she says, it's so unaccessible. And the second context is a course for majors she teaches on the novel. And, you know, she knows she can't cover all of the novel. So on the syllabus, I wrote several other additional goals because I really was like, what do I want them to get from this course? I didn't care if the goals were accessible or not, that you walk away with a better sense of what you would like to read, what types of novels you like and don't like, what types of novels you'd like to read more of, thinking a lot about just different styles of novels and what appealed to them and what didn't. So a lot of the additional course goals had to do with students getting ownership over and confidence about their own mindset over how a novel should work. And she made this very explicit. And she also commented, you know, aspirational goals, even goals that might not be completed this semester, are goals we can set. So what have I noticed about these unaccessible aspirational goals? Most faculty addressed them explicitly with students and explained why they were goals. Some were directly connected to student work in the discipline, others were more connected to their lives in general. Some were aimed at more immediate shifts in attitude or perspectives, others were aimed at action in the more distant future. And all of these goals were covered via various sorts of writing assignments, ranging from low stakes journaling and reflective writing to writing to learn assignments where they took on personae and different perspectives, extensive formal research projects, really big ones, and even final essay exams, adding them in there somehow, making them a little accessible, I guess. What can we do with this? Here are my thoughts, and I'll be eager to hear your thoughts in our discussion. Because as a WAC director, the course learning objectives usually are the start of my discussions with my faculty colleagues. And then usually we quickly move on to how the writing assignments can support those learning objectives. So what if instead we lingered for a moment on the objectives, asking questions such as these? If there were just one thing from your course that students took with them into their lives, what would it be? Why is that important to you? Why might that be important for them? How might you communicate this goal to your students? How might your writing assignments support this goal? Why might we have these discussions? Well, a few reasons. Faculty are passionate about these larger aspirational goals. And as we all know, passion fuels teaching. Why not tap into that passion? Also, being explicit about these goals may help students to see the larger purpose in courses that fulfill general or major requirements, and thereby improve their engagement. And having goals for students that go beyond traditional content coverage and extend into their lives, both the present and the future lives, conveys a sense of care for students. And I think it's especially important for maintaining student engagement during these challenging times to convey that care. I have these goals for you. They're beyond the goals that you'll need just for this course. I want to thank you for listening. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion on August 3rd. Thanks.